Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, a Jewish doctor of psychiatry, lived in Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century when the World War II broke out. And Viktor Frankl, being Jewish, was then, he and his wife and his whole family, was put into a concentration camp, we all know, Auschwitz. And while he was in that concentration camp, in most part because he was a psychiatrist, he was most interested in observing the human response, human beings in that circumstance, these incredibly horrible, horrific, cruel circumstance, and observed how people responded in the midst of such cruelty we can't even imagine, much less conceive of. When he came out of Auschwitz, wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, in which he developed a field of therapy called logotherapy, in which he argued that really what is key to our understanding of ourselves and how we are in the world, what's key to understanding ourselves is the meaning we find in life. And that every human being is in search and trying to make sense, and particularly those who were in the concentration camps. And he said, as he wrote in this book and reflected on this, he talked about how, you would see humanity at its worst in these concentration camps, people, scrabbling after food and hurting each other, and you would see people engaged in behaviors trying to survive that I think we all can imagine. And he did see that. But Frankl also saw something he wasn't expecting. He saw people give up and die. He saw people struggle and be mean to their fellow prisoners. But what he also encountered was these unique people who had chosen compassion and caring even in such circumstances. There's a quote I want to read to you that he had in the book. "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offered sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man, a human being, but one thing. Everything can be taken, but one thing. The last of the human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, more or less to choose one's own way." The last freedom we have as human beings, the capacity to choose one's way. To choose, no matter the circumstances, no matter what happens in one's life, to choose a path, as Frankl says, of compassion, of caring, of forgiveness, and of sacrifice. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Probably, I would say, probably the most familiar phrase we have in the Lord's Prayer. One of the ones that we all probably know the most by heart. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It seems straightforward. It seems very clear what we are supposed to do. Forgive sin in ourselves and those around us. And I can give you some platitudes about that. But I want to actually point out that this is far more complex than we really imagine. And it's actually far more radical than we really would like to realize. And we get a hint of this Because everyone knows if we went to some ecumenical setting, right? We'd say the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed. All of us would be going along until we get to this one line, right? And then it dissolves into chaos. In fact, we've printed out the Lord's Prayer, but sometimes we'll just put debts and debtors there to remind people that's what we Presbyterians say. But it dissolves into chaos, and actually, if you're ever leading in an ecumenical setting, it actually takes a few minutes to get back where we're all in the same prayer again. Sin always trips us up, right? Some say sin, some say debts, some say trespasses. And of course, in our Reformed tradition, we say debtors. And some joke, well, it's because you Presbyterians are all about the money, right? That's the joke. But actually, there are so many words, Greek words for sin in the Bible. That means so many different subtle things. So it's interesting to look at the Greek word for debts in our text this morning in the Lord's Prayer. And we chose debts because we believe it is a more accurate reflection of the very word Jesus used, the Greek word ophilimia, which means owing a debt, an obligation, both financial and moral. And so we use debts because we believe that's Jesus' intent. Immediately after he does the Lord's Prayer, he talks about, in the Gospel of Luke and Matthew, he talks about the need to forgive trespasses. He uses the Greek word for trespass, but in the Lord's Prayer itself, it says debts. And the truth be known, we're probably comfortable with the word sin, but you're really meddling if you're talking about money, folks. Right? And it does have this idea behind it of forgiving debts. And we see this, the echo of this, in the text from Leviticus, in which God commands the Hebrew people that the way in which they'll be organized is just, and that every 50 years, all debts will be forgiven. And we kind of step back from that and say, whoa, that's kind of radical, isn't it? Couldn't work in the world. But what's interesting about that then is Jesus is kind of conveying, forgive us our debts. It kind of gives us a sense. It'd be like if tomorrow was the year of Jubilee, your home loan would be forgiven. Your credit card debt would be forgiven. Your car payment were forgiven. And what would that really, truly feel like? To have all those debts forgiven. Now, my bank probably wouldn't take that theological argument. But it does give us a glimpse of something that he's saying profoundly about forgiveness. That freedom one would feel, that sense of being set free, made free, because you no longer carry any debt. To be able to choose because one no longer carries any more debt, both financial and moral. It's the line from the text. It kind of is the good news of the story. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. That really, forgive us our debts, is a statement of being set free from the debts that define our lives. And that's actually pretty radical. It's actually believing in the grace of God that all the debts I think I owe to God, all the things the debts I owe to those around me, all the things, burdens, guilt, shame that limits me and limits my freedom have now been forgiven. And that really the response to those words is to feel set free. Every Sunday when we say that prayer, every Sunday there should be a sense of freedom. From all those debts we think we've accumulated in our lives, all those burdens we might bear in our hearts. Now, when we hear that phrase, forgive us our debts as we forgive the others, sometimes what we tend to do is we tend to think of that, well, God forgives me if I forgive other people, right? That's how we might hear that, but that's not what the Greek communicates. God's forgiveness is not dependent on anything you do. God's grace is not dependent on you being a good person or being a person who does the right actions or the right things. God's forgiveness comes to you out of the abundance of God's love. God forgives not because we do, just because God forgives. So forgive us our debts as we forgive others communicates something else. What it communicates is we catch a glimpse of that freedom, we catch a glimpse of that joy, of that jubilee, only and sometimes only when we forgive the debt of others. God forgives us, but often we do not fully grasp it until we forgive our debtors. And only then can we get a sense of freedom about that. Now that's a radical thing. To feel free to live one's life and leave behind those burdens often we create in our own minds, those guilts and shames we carry around with us. The continual ways sometimes we continue to be selfish and self-focused, that this isn't really about sin in that sense. It's about not carrying that anymore. Your debt has been forgiven and is continually forgiven. And because of that, you're finally free to choose compassion and love and forgiveness for others. I thought of that the past few weeks. One of the things that hit me as I was reading the news, one of the things that was really heavy on my heart was reading in the newspaper about the two young people from Parkland, right, who committed suicide. Then soon after that, there was a father of one of the children killed in a school shooting who killed himself. And I felt such grief at that, the reality of what they must have been carrying with them, the reality of the pain that existed in their lives, and I wish for them. I would pray for them and for all affected by the school shootings and the great grief that encounters our life. I would pray for us all. A sense of being set free from that. So that we could choose another way. Just this morning, I think it was maybe yesterday's paper in New York Times, there was an essay, and I was totally unaware of this. It was an essay 24 years after, it was kind of a photo essay, 24 years after the Rwandan war, really the Rwandan genocide in which a tribe of Hutus killed hundreds of thousands of a tribe of Tutsis. And that was horrific enough. I mean, just in how that society was struggling to confront and name that pain and grief. But one of the things I didn't realize was part of the campaign of these militias was to rape thousands of women. Over and over again. And the consequence of that was now, about 25 years later, there are children. Well, the consequence of that afterwards, we may not think about this, was that there were a number of children born from that rape, from that shame, from that pain. And what was interesting to me is this reporter went back and interviewed some of those children who are now 24, 25 years old. And how did they cope with, how did they live with this reality in which they often didn't know who their father was other than they were identified as children of killers? And how did their parents tell them? How did their mother, because many of them didn't have a father because of the shame around what had happened? And over again, I can't imagine, I try to imagine what it must be like to have your mother tell you, this is what happened to you, this is what happened to me, and now you were a child from that horrific act. And if you read this article, what is interesting, these people in Rwanda still broken, still grieving, still struggling with a meaning. Over and over, these young people share their pain, but over and over again share their hope. And that they are going to choose a different way. And while that is hard for us to imagine to be forgiven, many of them will say, I forgive, and it has set me free. What do we need to forgive in ourselves and those around us to set us free to love? Amen.